Hi, this is Paul from Passy's World of ICT, and welcome to our Access Database training. First up today, we're going to just look at a general introduction to databases, and we'll also have a look at Microsoft Access Database and some of its features. In the training, there will be, of course, separate learning modules on each of these features, but today we just want to give you an overview of databases to get started on the course. So let's take it away. Now, it's the age of large databases. We've all used YouTube and Facebook and Instagram, and those databases hold millions and millions of records on them. And it's quite surprising that they've been able to actually build databases that big in giant server farms. So what are we going to look at first up? We'll look at what the purpose is of an RDBMS, which is just a big word for Relational Database Management System, which is just, we can call a database. Some of the different formats used for storing different items in the database, how we actually create the database components and some sort of design ideas for them, what's good design, and then we'll have a separate section that's just a general introduction to Access. Okay, database solutions. In the old days, when my dad was alive or my grandpa, you had to, just to find a camera, there were ads in newspapers or magazines, and you look at one of those ads, you go to a shop and look at it. But now, of course, there's online shopping, places like eBay. You just put in a search and you can get thousands and thousands of different things to look at. And that's a lot quicker. So databases have made things much bigger in storage, but at the same time, much faster as well. It's not just a matter of having the eBay shop. Of course, things have to get shipped all around the world, and there has to be accounting take place to track all the money and payments. So often, one database is connected to many other databases, as in this diagram, where we have 3 different databases all connecting and working together and talking to each other and exchanging data. Okay, so in a relational database management system, we're just taking eBay because that is a really large database, you can just type in that you want to look at Adidas basketball shoes. Now, what that'll then bring up is a whole listing of just those items from eBay. So this is called running a query, where you just want to get certain things out of the database and look at them because the database itself is far too big to look at and try and find these items individually. In a database, you also have a thing called metadata, which is a principle that we need to understand. Metadata is where in the database they store information about the actual item. So you have the item, which is some data, but then there's information about that item as well. So in Google Images, some of the metadata you have is the thumbnail of the picture, but then it also stores the actual web location of that picture as well. In our photography that we do, we use Flickr as our photo storage system, and in that's really good if you're looking at your photos or at somebody else's because it has metadata, it has information about the camera that took the photo and what settings they used. So this can be really handy to look up when you've done a job previously and they were good photos and you're doing a similar job again. You can look at your old photos in Flickr and find out what settings you used on the camera and make sure you use those settings again. So that can be very handy for photographers in particular. Now, in a database, the big advantage is there's no redundancy. If we had this system here in a spreadsheet for a photo business where we're storing jobs, you can see that one person in there who's highlighted has their email address and it's stored on every job they do. Now, if they change email address, that's an issue because we've got to go through the spreadsheet on every single job and change that email address. Now, in a database, the storage setup is different and you would only have to change that address once on the data that's related to that person and not have to trawl through the whole database and group of data and do that many times. There are limitations with databases. One of them is, I suppose, the cost and the work setting it up. So often only a business or education institutions or large multinational companies will have databases because for other people it's too much expense and time and effort setting it up. Now, a database structure, how we store things is we have these concepts of a table, a record, and a field. Okay, so a record is just one item in the database, which might be one person, and we store different pieces of information about that person. Each different piece of information, that's called a field. So a field is kind of the smallest thing in the database, and then fields can be arranged into records. And then we have a group of people all with similar characteristics or belonging to a group, that all goes into a table. An example here is the attendance system that's used at a high school that I've worked at, and in that attendance system you can see we have rows going across here, and that's for each of the students. So there's one row for each student. Now for the student you have different fields that can be filled out. So are they present in the class, for example, or are they absent? You can click in whichever field it is. And fields don't have to be radio buttons like this that you click in. There's text fields here for the time and their name. You can also have picture box fields, which we'll be learning about in Microsoft Access as well. So data can be in image form, text form, or other indicator forms as well. So each row is a student. This whole group of rows for this particular class, the Year 10 Computing Multimedia, that's a table. And in the system we'd have several other tables, like at the moment a mathematics class is running that's being taught by a certain teacher in a certain room. It has its own table. The history class has its own table. The English class, which is running at the moment, has its own table. So we have lots of tables in the database. Each table has records. The record corresponds to each student, and each student has information about them, and the detailed information about them is called the fields. Now, when you have a database, we have a table that it's stored in, and that looks a lot like an Excel spreadsheet. So you have columns here with headings on them, and underneath each heading you have information. The information's arranged in rows. So in this table we have a bunch of different cars, and each car has an Australian license plate on it. It's a certain type of car, so each row is one car. Now, a database spreadsheet looking table like this can get really big, so often we'd usually use forms. So a form is like a screen form. It's a lot easier to see, things are spread out, and it's a lot easier to work with than the table. So we'll also be learning about forms in databases. And you've probably used forms online when you go shopping to fill things out. You need to have your email, your delivery address, all those sorts of things. The potential problem is that, especially with things like email addresses, people could still type in something that looks like an email address, but it's not actually their correct address. In Microsoft Access, we will learn how to do validation. So at least we can check that they've typed in something with an @ sign and then something else, and check that at least it looks like the right kind of structure, even if it isn't a real working email address. And we'll have a separate learning module all about these things on validation. So paying for goods online, there's always forms to fill out. Now, usually for our tables, we set up some sort of design document beforehand where we list out, okay, what are the things that we're going to group together in that particular table? What are the fields we're going to use? How long are the fields? Because we don't want to waste a lot of empty space storing things with extra spaces on them aren't needed. Well, what sort of validation or checking could we add in to make sure people don't make mistakes typing the data in? And what sort of validation error messages are we going to give if they have made a mistake? All right, so that was the end of the general introduction about databases, and now we're going to talk specifically about Microsoft Access. If you want to take a little mini break and pause the video here, that's fine, perhaps a good idea, and then we can continue. Okay, let's have a look at Microsoft Access. Okay, Access is software where we can actually create and manage databases. There's two different icons there. The top one is for the newer versions of Access, like 2016, 2019. The lower one, I think, was from Access 2013. But all of them, when we start up the Microsoft app, the first thing we do is we go to File and we use Blank Database. And we'll have a lesson on that, how to set that up and get going. So what is the database? As we've seen, it's a structured collection of records. In the old days, there was things like a filing cabinet or a dictionary, perhaps a diary you were putting things in. Okay, Access is one of these DBMSs. It's a database management system, which means we not only store the data, but we can do a whole lot of other things as well. Okay, now there's data and then there's information. Think of data as the raw material, like these cobs of corn. All they have in is, it's corn kernels, but they can be processed into something like cornflakes, which is kind of like turned into something else that's perhaps more useful than the raw corn. So data, we could have just these items here, Murray, 35,000, and a date, but we don't really know what they mean. When we assemble it into information, like perhaps running a report out of our database, we find out that Murray's a salesperson on $35,000 a year, and his start date with the company was July 18th, 2006. Okay, why do people use databases? They're great for storing a lot of information. You can have multiple people accessing that information at the same time, and you can store a lot of material in there. Let's have a look at this sort of information problem here. So a gym has recently opened up and they're signing up members. When they sign up a member, obviously you need their name, address, date of birth, and a whole bunch of other information about allergies they might have, injuries, any health issues, their exercise history, what their fitness goals are. We need to record all of that information for every customer that signs up in an electronic format. Now, people love Excel. They've used Excel and they love Excel, and Excel's great. We could set up all the columns we need for that information and we could type it in for each person. There are some problems though with trying to use Excel for a business solution like this. For one thing, the data is very wide across the screen there. We've got a lot of different items we're storing about the customer. And what if two customers have the same name that have joined up? How are we going to tell whose is who? We can't use drop-down boxes easily. So things like Mr., Mrs., Doctor, it'd be much easier if you could just have a pick and click box instead of having to type it in. There's nothing in place to ensure validation of any sort. So for allergies, someone could put none, someone else might write nuts, someone might write yes, shellfish. So all sorts of issues about how people enter the data into the system. So look, Excel is great for small little jobs. So just like having a little kitchen in a little apartment, just cooking for one or two people, that little kitchen works fine. Same with Excel. If you've got a little job, if you just want to keep track of your weekly spending, Excel is great. But if you want to have a database or a data store of information and get reports out of it, like perhaps a marketing campaign for people that are male, a certain age, live in a certain suburb, you want to run a special class for them, or perhaps give them a special product or marketing, well then it's an issue in Excel because we have to write complicated if statements. Okay, we're much better off for businesses using things like an industrial kitchen that can do a lot of stuff and do it quickly. So that's what Microsoft Access is compared with Microsoft Excel. So the database is a lot easier to use and can do a lot more things a lot more easily, and we'll see that as we learn Microsoft Access. Okay, Microsoft Access has the familiar look and feel of Windows because it is a Microsoft product. It's very easy to start building simple databases, as you'll find in the learning modules, and you can also make quite sophisticated systems. We can run it all on our laptop for developing the database, which makes it nice and easy, and it's a true relational database. Okay, you just need to know that there are a few different data types used, just like there's different Star Wars droids. We have different database types we use. So we have text, number, date and time, and we have this one called Boolean, named after the mathematician that invented it. So that can be a yes/no field. So do you have any allergies? It could just be a simple click and pick yes/no box. We do need a primary key. Remember that problem with two people with the same name? So Access takes care of that. You can set a primary ID for records in your table, like give them a student ID number, and Access will automatically generate unique numbers and keep track of them for you, which is fantastic. So there's an example there, just a Victorian Australia driver's license. Yeah, all of the licenses have a unique license number on them. So databases always have this thing called a primary key to uniquely identify people. When you're working in Access, down the left-hand side, you'll see this database window, which shows you all the different types of items we have in Access. So we have our tables, our queries, our forms, and our reports. When you are looking at a table, you can be in Datasheet view or design view. The bottom one here, design view, that's when you set up the headings for the table. So for each item in there, you can set the field size, whether it's text or number or date, time. And then once that's all set up in design view, then you flick over to Datasheet view, which is up the top here. It looks a lot like Excel, and then you can actually type rows and records into the database. For getting through the database, there's a little navigator down the bottom, a bit like your YouTube player and a YouTube video, I guess, where you can go to different records, go to the start, go to the end, click the shiny sun sort of thing on the end here if you want to put a new record into the database. And as we discussed previously, databases have a structure where there's tables of groups related items, records, which has the details for one particular item, and those individual details are called fields. So here's an example of a database table. We have records, which are the rows. So we have a row for Smith, a row for Thomas, a row for Van Winkle. So they are your records. The fields are the columns in the database table. So they're the individual items that we're storing for each record. So tables are set up in design view as we discussed, and then once that's done, you can go to Datasheet view, and it's a lot like using a spreadsheet. What we will be learning in the course is how to design and build a functional database and enter business data into it. Perform queries so that you can just get out specific pieces of information and not look at the whole thing. Generate reports, which is very easy to do once you have the queries done. And we're going to create screen forms, which make it a lot easier to look at data and enter it. So if you want to pause the video now and take a mini break, that's fine. And in this final section, we're just going to look a little bit at the queries, forms, reports, design rules in Microsoft Access. Okay, on to part 2, queries. Now with queries, you can look at the data in the database. So in this database for a medical practice, we've got appointments for patients, and we've got who the patients are, and each patient has an appointment with a doctor. Now, if we want just the appointments for Dr. Seuss and Dr. Jekyll here, rather than sort of get all the ones for Seuss and then get all the ones for Jekyll and join them together, it's actually a lot easier to just get any appointment that doesn't involve Dr. Pepper. So we write it as not Pepper down here in the query, and that gives us our other ones which don't belong to Pepper, so such as Jekyll and Seuss. So often using the not in a query is a lot simpler way of doing it. Here's an Australian registration number. We've got all these different states, kind of like states, provinces. And if you want to not have to list out every single state, you can just say the ones you're not interested in. So we don't want the ones in Victoria, and that will give us all the other ones. So you can put not Vic, or you can use this less than greater than symbol in Access. And this is all covered in our database queries module lesson. We have forms. Forms make it a lot easier to enter information in, and you can have menu forms as well. So you can set up a main menu called a switchboard in Access, and we'll be learning how to do that. You can get reports out of Access, which format the data, make it look nice. You can then print it into a PDF and email it to people. You could even be old school and print it out on paper if you wanted to. Now, some of the basic design rules is data is broken up completely when we store it. So we don't store an address like this, like it'd be written on an envelope. We break it up so that we've got the street and the city and the state and the zip code separately. Now, why do we do that? The reason is because then when we run queries, we can find all the people that are from a particular city or from a particular zip code or postcode. And that makes it a lot more flexible for forms and reporting. Okay, another thing is don't abbreviate field names too much. If you make them tiny like this, like FN, LN, DOH, what are those things? Well, this second example is a much better way to name your fields when you're setting them up in Design View. Like give them meaningful names where people can tell what they stand for. Now, unique field names are not required. If we've got a patient table and patients have a last name and we're storing the doctors as well and they have a last name, we can actually use last name twice because Access will do all the figuring out for us. When we look at this last name here, the yellow one, Access will figure out that that's actually the doctor table last name. Okay, so you don't have to worry about giving them separate names. You can reuse the same name. Now, we don't put calculated fields in tables. So hours times the rate per hour and calculate it. We don't store it in the table. What we do is we do it by running queries, forms, and reports, and we'll see that in the Access course. So there's a typical report we can get out. They are very useful for the database. Once we have built a database solution right at the very end, how we evaluate whether it's a good solution or not are using these criteria here. So using the database should be a lot quicker and easier. There should be validation rules, and we'll do a whole learning module about that gets the data as accurate as you can when it's getting entered into the database. And we should see efficiency improvements for the business that's using the database because we've spent quite a bit of time and they've probably spent money paying the developer to do the work. So, you know, they need to get quite substantial benefits from that. Okay, so thanks for watching. That sort of gives you a big overview of what databases are and their basic structure. And you're now ready to proceed to the next lesson where we're going to look at the business case study for our course, and then we can break up the course into tables, queries, forms, and have lots of sort of bite-sized lessons on each of them. So that's it for now, and we'll see you in the next lesson on Microsoft Access.